On the desk sits an abacus and a leather ledger. It only keeps the count. 10,000 years before the Common Era in the Fertile Crescent, the moment a family stored more grain than it ate, someone had to record who held the surplus. That record was the first economic weapon. It decided who ate through winter and who did not. 5 times in the long account, the entries stopped adding and started multiplying. 5 revolutions, 5 columns in the same book. What a field could grow, how far a market could reach, who owned the labor. Each paid for its gain in an old order it quietly erased, and every ledger meets the entry it was never designed to hold. Welcome to the Ledger of Revolutions, where economies are read like the books they keep. Go back to the first stored grain and the plow about to change everything it touched. I read this column the way I read every other. Before the plow, the bottleneck was not the soil, but the belly that reset to 0 each morning. A forager's count never rose past what a stomach needed that same week. Then the calendar broke. Around 10,000 years before the Common Era, in the Fertile Crescent, wild grain that shattered and scattered its seed gave way to strains that held it on the stalk. That was the invention, a plant taught to wait for harvest. Now the field returned more than the mouth required, and the surplus had to go somewhere. A stored sack of grain is a claim on next winter, so someone stayed to guard it. That guard needed walls. The walls grew into a village. The village needed more grain from the very same field. The loop closed on itself. The ledger showed the gain in bushels. It never once showed the bill. The skeletons read it plainly. The early farmer stood some inches shorter, worked longer, ate narrower than the forager before him. Tied to one patch of ground, a bad harvest could ruin. In Britain, farm labor fell from near 6 in 10 workers around 1700 to barely 2 in 10 by 1850. The same bargain scaled to a nation. The price was that a people could no longer walk away from it. I have read ledgers like this before. A field can hold a family in place. A factory floor holds an entire town. For centuries, the bottleneck was muscle. The cloth a country made rose no faster than the arms it could feed. Then a man wagered against muscle itself. James Watt's improved steam engine, patented in 1769, burned roughly 1/3 the coal the old Newcomen engine did for the same work. He bet that coal, not sinew, could turn the wheel, and he was right. Set beside a spinning frame, the loop turned on itself. Cheaper cloth found more buyers. More buyers pulled in more looms. More looms demanded more hands, and every hand made the next bale cheaper still. The abacus recorded the payoff. Between 1780 and 1840, Britain's raw cotton grew from 7 million pounds a year to over 500 million. The ledger did not record the cost, only the profit column, never the one still blank. It cost the spinner her hearth, the weaver his village, the household its old bargain, that work and home were one place. The men who owned the machines now owned the hours too, and took the gain the wages never showed. The people feeding it no longer owned the room they stood in, and no ledger yet had a column for who held the labor and who took the profit. That column was about to open. I turned the page the same way I always do. The steam engine had bound a whole people to the factory floor. The next revolution bound a continent to a schedule. Before the rail, distance was the one tax no maker could dodge. A wagon ride could spoil a harvest before it reached a buyer. Then, a country was stitched shut with iron. The American Transcontinental Railroad, finished in 1869, cut a 6-month wagon crossing to about a week. Rail needed better steel. Better steel laid more rail. Between 1870 and the Great War, the two fed each other, cheaper every turn. Mile after mile went into the ledger. Not one entry asked who rode in the caboose and who walked the ties. Work was sorted into a tall order, owner over foreman over hands, the wage falling with every rung. When Ford's line arrived in 1913, building a car dropped from 12 hours to 90 minutes and fixed each worker to one bolt. That was the price, and the column would not close until someone learned to move money as fast as this rail now moved steel. I keep this ledger the way I keep the rest. Rail had put a continent on a timetable. Now the timetable itself wants a single owner. Then a room of men wagered that one currency could hold the count for all the rest. In 1944, 44 nations met at Bretton Woods and pegged the world to $1 worth 35 to an ounce of gold. A safer peg pulled in more trade. More trade leaned harder on the peg. Money now moved at wire speed, faster than any ship carrying the goods it paid for. The abacus counted the clearings, not the leash. It cost the small country its own weather. Britain learned it in '67, a run on reserves forcing the pound down overnight. It cost every ledger the comfort that its columns closed at home. Now, a bad harvest in one country arrived as a run on the savings of another, half a world away. 4 columns closed: field, market, labor, money, and each one bought its gain by pricing a stranger's bread. One column stayed open, the one no war had settled. Could a country wired to the rest still feed itself alone? I read this last loop the way I read the others. The dollar bound the world to one vault. The last revolution bound it into one ledger. One column still stood open, and this revolution came to close it. The wire that let a room in one city set a farmer's price in another. The bottleneck now was not distance or trust, but scatter. A price known in one city, a rumor in the next. Then a room of counting machines was pressed onto a fingernail of silicon. The first commercial microprocessor, Intel's 4004, carried about 2,300 transistors on one chip in 1971. That same chip went on to seat the world online. 40 million people in the mid-90s, over 2 billion by 2010, market folding into market. One machine now watched every column on Earth at once, and still answered to no one for what it cost. It cost the small country its last wall against the world's hunger. It cost the worker his floor, now bid on from a continent away. The digital column closed at last, a ledger kept everywhere, owned nowhere. Never again read at the speed a man can walk. 5 objects sit on the desk tonight, one to a column. A grain of wheat, a rail spike, a factory rivet, a paper dollar, and a chip small enough to lose in a fold of the ledger. Each was a wager a room of people once made against the world they had. So I run the one sum the ledger was kept for, not what each thing built, but what it cost an hour of a working man's life. In 1700, that hour bought bread and little else, answering to the field outside a man's door. By the 1970s, that same hour answered to a price set on a chip he would never hold, in a city he would never see. The grain cost the farmer his weather. One bad season, and the ledger turned against him. The spike cost him his place in the order, foreman above, ties below. The rivet cost him the floor beneath his wage. The dollar cost him the comfort that his columns closed at home. The chip cost him the last wall between his harvest and the world's hunger, which leaves the entry no revolution has yet made, a machine that keeps the count itself. When the ledger learns to read the ledger, whose hour does it price then? That is the book I mean to open next. So tell me first, of the 5, which moved the hour of labor the furthest? The plow, the rail, the factory, the dollar, or the chip? Argue it below. This is the ledger of revolutions, where economies are read by the hours they quietly spend.